Welcome to Blitzscaling, a startup. I am with Nama Moran.
Hi.
Hi, Nama. You are the very fancy co-founder of Cheetah Technologies, which is a wholesale food and restaurant supplies marketplace, which raised from a lot of money from a lot of fancy VCs. It's very successful.
Thank you.
You founded multiple startups, and you've had a really interesting career, and we'll go into all that. But really, our topic today, like what we want to go into, is like, how do you, as a founder of a startup, manage the chaos and the complexity of being the founder and CEO of a company? And how do you, like, what are some of the tricks or some of the approaches that you adopted to manage that and not go insane? So on that, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Julian. I'm so happy to be here.
And you're a really interesting person. Maybe we can start there. I think you grew up on a farm in Israel. What was this? A farm? Was it I know the famous Israeli farms concept, or like kibbutz. So was it a kibbutz, or was it a normal farm, or what was that like?
So it wasn't a kibbutz, it's called a moshav. I would say like 1 degree less communist at the time. And so when I grew up, we had about 75 families, this like beautiful community. We shared agriculture, we shared our cultural lives. And still to this day, when I go and visit, I feel like I'm back with a big, expanded family, a beautiful place to grow up.
It's so interesting. And so where in Israel was it? Because I know the northern part of Israel is very different from the south. It's like more of a desert-ish. So like
Yeah,
where
my village is smack in the middle. So, if you know a town called Netanya, it's in that area, and it's about 10 minutes drive from the sea, from one of my favorite beaches in Israel called Bet Yanai.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, I've been to Tel Aviv, I guess, should be not that far from there.
Yeah, it's about 30 minutes drive north of Tel Aviv.
Yeah. So, okay, there's I guess, a pattern of like Israelis being really great entrepreneurs. And I guess the WeWork CEO is kind of a kibbutz guy. So I feel that there's a pattern of people from Israeli farms being really good entrepreneurs. What did you learn as like growing up in that way that's like different from most people, and that you feel helped you kind of have an entrepreneurial mindset?
It's a really good question. I haven't yet reflected on what specifically in that kind of growing environment, like in a moshav, was related to maybe me becoming an entrepreneur. I think it's something that comes from my home. My father was an entrepreneur, and I think that was probably an influence, a more direct influence. But I would say that in my childhood, I always felt very safe and very secure. It was a very safe place at the time when I grew up. I was going out of the house like on by myself with my dog in nature, playing with other kids, feeling like the whole community was like this expanded family, gave me a sense of safety. And as I'm reflecting on it now, talking to you, I believe that this deep sense of safety and security is perhaps what enabled me to then feel more comfortable about taking risks, and be okay with failure. I think that these are fundamental traits that entrepreneurs need to have and embrace. And if you come from that sense of safety and security, I feel it just creates a better catalyst for taking risks later on in life. So thank you for making me reflect on it. It's actually the first time I made that connection.
Yeah, well, I had a back and forth on Twitter with Chris, my co-host. The one time I logged into Twitter in the last 6 months. and he had posted something about how having kind of a safety net
Mm,
lets you take risk. And we
mm,
had back and forth about it. I think they're like one of the things that came out of it I felt was particularly insightful was this sense that being okay with a really basic lifestyle enables you to take more risk, right? So if like you want to
mm.
have a fancy like cars and a fancy house, and you can't take that much risk because you don't
Yeah.
want to do that stuff. And if you don't care, then you're able to take a lot more risk. Like
Hmm.
I I feel as if like maybe I'm assuming that your lifestyle in a village in Israel would have been simple-ish, and also
Yeah.
knowing you a little bit, you seem to have like a more like embrace that. Like, do you think that's also part of it, or how do you think of that?
Yeah. Again, you're making me reflect as we speak. I did grow up in, pretty humble, environment. And yeah, my father also as an entrepreneur had to deal with lots of ups and downs and had several financial failures. And that's something that we did experience at the house. Um, and yeah, and I'm wondering if that was another thing that was kind of, preparing me to handle failures or difficulties later on, because as a child I kind of experienced my family going through it. And I think that's another important thing to remember, when someone is taking risks and maybe is meeting with failure, is that there is always a beginning, middle, and an end to everything. Um, and yeah, like as far as the humble beginnings from like what do you need in order to be happy, I think that's another thing that is very important, because later on in life, for example, I found that connection to nature was just like one of the most important things for me in being able to replenish myself and resource myself during difficult times. And that was, again, very anchored in me from my childhood. It was like way more important to be connected to nature than having like fancy cars and so on. So I think these kind of simple things that are actually available to you everywhere if you just want them, are also becoming later on like another arrow in the quiver that you can use as an entrepreneur.
So, in my mind, the four most beautiful places in the world are Israel,
Hmm.
California, Costa Rica, and Greece. Like the places I've been to, those are the most amazing kind of like natural areas. And um, you're currently in Costa Rica. You technically live in beautiful part of California. Uh,
Hmm.
do you think that's like you make these choices because you kind of like value that from having grown up in such a like amazing, magical kind of natural environment?
I was just very lucky, to be honest. I mean, to come to California, I come to the US. I went to school actually on the East Coast, and then fell in love with everything that I heard was happening in California, and made my way here. I had no idea just how gorgeous California is. It's actually interesting because as I speak to you, I am in California right now. I'm visiting in
Oh,
San
yeah.
Francisco. Even though I moved with my family to Costa Rica about 2 years ago. And yeah, I mean, living in California and in the Bay Area, being so close to nature, phenomenal nature, like the redwood trees, or for me, one of my favorite places in the world is the Yuba River up in near Nevada City. It was just a blessing, and definitely something that kept me living here in California for many years. And Costa Rica is another, incredible, fortunate, and unexpected event that happened. We just, myself, my partner, and our daughter went there for a visit of a friend and just fell in love with nature there. But I do think that this like love of nature, which I felt was embedded in me from my childhood, growing up so close to nature, has been like a guiding force in my life, whether I intended for it to be, maybe not kind of consciously, but it has been like a huge part of my life and has supported me in that.
So did end up, like, I think most Israelis go into the military. Did you, is that something that you also did?
I did not. It was a decision I took when I was about 17. A very tough decision at the time, and definitely also a tough decision, especially if we're thinking about what is happening in Israel today. But yeah, decided that I'm not going to go to the military, and was able to get myself released. And the rest is kind of the history of my life. Was the first real adult decision I took.
Interesting. Yeah, because that's unusual, I think, for Israeli. I think you're the only Israeli I know who hasn't been to the military. And so you didn't go to the military. Instead, you went directly to university. Is that what you did?
No, I actually lived in Italy for a couple of years. So instead of going to the military, I went and I lived in Italy. And I studied there in a very special place, an interdisciplinary center that combined studies of things like religion, philosophy, together with neuroscience and psychology. I also learned how to speak Italian and was really exposed to an incredible amount of influences. It was very interesting people that I met from all over the world, and another place that really, really shaped, my life and who I am today.
How old were you when you did that?
I was 17, so I lived there
Cool.
from 17 to 21.
That's so interesting. I so I had this. I spent like a year in India when I was 18,
Uh-huh. Wow.
and um, it's a long story why I did that, but I did, and I really feel that that was one of the most impactful experiences in my life. Like I'm Canadian, and Canadians are just really nice, and like everything's clean and everything's functional. And probably you would know this. There's so many Israelis in India, so you must have at least heard a lot of
Yeah, of
stories where like
course.
everyone's always trying to rip you off, and you have to like fight for everything. And that was like so. Like I hated India for the first 4 months that I was there.
Where
Um,
were you in India? Were you traveling all around, or you were settling in some particular place?
I went through the north of India,
Ah,
uh,
okay.
um, and yeah, but I really feel that like like for example, at the time at least, it was impossible to buy train tickets. Like you had to like go in line, and like people like pull you, and you have to fight to get train tickets. So at some point, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna take the train without a ticket. Like I'm just gonna walk in, and like if they come and ask me if I have my ticket, I'll just speak them in French, and then they'll go away. And you kind of have to, like that is not would not have been a natural thing for me.
Yeah.
Like I learned this, like more scrappy way of being there and then, and I don't think I could have, it could have shaped me as much if I had
Mm.
been, well, let's say my age now. Like it's just not the same. So
Yeah.
I guess the question is like, how do you like? Do you feel that having spent time in Italy at that age
Mm.
shaped significantly, and then like how?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's such an important point, and something I think every parent should want their kids to go and travel the world at this age, because it is a formative age. It's really the age in which you are kind of there is this like theory of the stages of life, and how at the beginning you're defining kind of who you are just like through your body and your interaction with your body using skills like language and movement. And that's kind of what happens in the first 7 years of your life. And then after that, you're kind of defining yourself within society, and that's kind of what happened after the age of 7, when you start going to school and you start finding your place in society. But then later on in your late teens is when you actually start defining who you are as an individual, and sometimes you have to individuate yourself from your society. And that's why earlier I mentioned that for me, the decision not to go to the military was my first real adult decision, because in Israel, going to the military is critical. It's vital for the country, and there is a lot of social pressure, for obvious reasons, which I'm not criticizing at this moment, to go to the military. And so not going to the military would have meant that I, would feel like a social pariah almost. And so taking that decision really required very, very deep investigation into who I am as an individual, separated from my family and from my society, and taking that decision. And I think that is the age in which this kind of influences, and I was influenced, by the way, in taking this decision already by, opening myself to like reading and reading philosophy, reading religion, reading about spirituality, this type of things that really kind of brought my attention into like a zoom out and outside of my family, outside of society, into who I am as like a person, a universal being. And so, yeah, later on when I lived in Italy, first of all, being able to learn another language already opens up your horizons, because languages are, a collection of essentially cognitive constructions put into words. And being able to access another set of cognitive constructions that are not part of what you're coming from already opens up your mind to think differently. There are like words in Italian that don't exist in Hebrew because they express, how do you call it, like mental state or, internal states that are very bespoke to the Italian people. They don't exist, among the Hebrew people. And so that kind of opens you up to see the world and experience the world in a very different way. And yeah, I was very, very fortunate in that particular school to meet people that have, dedicated their life to different paths of, personal growth and investigation. Some of them on the more like theological, spiritual path, and some of them were like neurosurgeons and psychotherapists that are all coming together and creating a synergy of their worldviews, and being exposed to that at such a young age definitely, created an incredible imprint. And again, I was just very, very fortunate to be there at that time.
Were most of the people there a lot older than you?
Yes, so by far, I was by far the youngest.
Huh. So what was, like, I don't know, like, how, like, do you think that like, are you a person who has been in situations where you're by far the youngest often? Like, is that something you've often done?
For many years at the beginning of my life, so kind of from my early teens, I think my interest started expanding beyond what, maybe I was able to easily find among my peer group. And I started hanging out with older people. I think until kind of more or less my late 20s, at which point I started like finding a lot more peers among my own age group and younger friends. And today I have friends of all ages. I have friends who are, much, much older than me. And I also have friends who are much younger than me. And I'm no longer the youngest person among my peer group, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like my wife and I have both gone through that same experience where, like, I think in many ways, like, I prefer spending time. Like, I used to only hang out with people who are a lot older than me. So I'm going to be 35 in 14 days, two weeks.
Oh, congratulations.
But like, I guess until I was 30, like, I was always the youngest. Even when I was running my last business, like, it was, very enterprisey, so everyone's older. And I, like, now I really, really want, like, I seek out people who are younger than me. I'm not sure, like, do you think that's a good thing for startup founders, or is that like how does that like what does that change in your career? I guess it gives you more learning opportunities.
The question is it a good thing for a startup founder to do what? Excuse me, maybe you can clarify.
Who, when you're younger, is seeking to be surrounded by older people? Like, is that like, do you think that helped you in your journey as a founder?
It's a good question. I think that everything we're talking about right now is kind of me looking at the hindsight and saying, how did that help me later on as a founder? I wasn't planning for it, and I think it's important to realize that you can't like plan out your life. I think the most important thing is to just be open up to learning from whatever happens in your life, and learning and unlearning and learning and unlearning. This is actually something that will help you as a founder. Because you can't plan out your life. Like, I didn't plan it out in a way that I will only have older friends. It just happened because I followed my interests and I followed my heart. In the same way that later on in my 20s, it converged and my age group now became very diverse and I started having younger friends. I do think as a startup founder and also as later on as a manager, it's just very important that you stay curious and open to talk to people of all ages and all walks of life, because you will be managing people from different backgrounds, different ages, and being able to be curious and open-minded to them and learning from them is what's going to make you just a better leader in general. As well as like when you're interacting with potential customers, you want to just have that like mentality of curiosity, and that is what's going to be very important for you as a founder.
So you eventually, went to university in Israel, and then went to university. I think you finished your degree at Cornell.
Correct. Yeah.
And what was that like? What I mean specifically is like, what was it like to move to the United States specifically versus just some other, country? Was there, my experience moving to the United States was qualitatively different, because you're kind of like entering the big leagues, right? Like it's a very, very different place from everywhere else in the world. Like, is that something that you experienced? And yeah, was there something just like different for you about being in the United States versus being anywhere else internationally?
Yeah, for sure. Just like every country has its own, characteristic. And also the United States is so huge, right? Like when I came here, I came and I entered into a very specific niche. At that time I already felt called to kind of go in like a business direction, and I was starting to plan out my life and figure out like what's going to be the best path. And at the time I figured that going into like a really good university in the United States is going to help me out. So while I started my undergrad degree at Tel Aviv University, I studied really, really hard so I can transfer to a good American university. And I was very lucky to get accepted into Cornell. And I was there for 2 years. Like I did my junior and senior year at Cornell. And then after that, went into New York City and worked in the finance industry for some time, and then made my way to California. I definitely think that I came into like the capitalistic game, that was like the path I took. I didn't go into like the surfer life, in California. I went deep into the capitalistic game, and you feel it and you sense it already from university. Like that was actually the one thing that was very felt, is that sense of intentionality and the direction that people had and how focused they were on their careers and how much they knew what they already wanted to do. That was very unexpected for me, because even by that time, most of them were actually younger than me. By the time I came to do my undergrad, I was, I think, 23. And so, yeah, they were like people in their junior year, probably like 19 years old or something like that. Yet it always felt like they know so much better than I do what they want to do in their lives. And all their career path was already laid ahead for them. Apparently, it starts at a much earlier age in the States. That was kind of something I did not expect. I have reflected on that a lot, and eventually I decided not to raise my daughter in the United States, because I feel that kids today need a different type of growing tracks. And also like the interaction of career and schooling at such an earlier age, where you have conferences and consulting companies and banking companies and whatnot already coming to school, and people go and they learn how to network. They're like only 19, 20 years old. I had to really like get on my game very quick. I was very unready to that. And so it was like a super accelerator for me in kind of going on to my career, going through that school. And yeah, and then, from there on, I kind of followed my heart, followed my intuition, and finally made my way to California and started my first company here.
And why, I guess you're still in the startup game. Like why are you still in the startup game? Most people give up. It's just too much for them. They can't take it. It doesn't matter if they succeed or fail. Like one startup is all that they have in them. How are you still doing this?
Yeah, I did several startups, and one after another. The first one failed. The second one was successful and got acquired by Groupon. The third one, started in one way and then evolved into another company that was, somewhat similar but different. And it still is running to this day as a company here in the Bay Area called Cheetah Technologies. I just think that I found what I love and what I'm really best at. I think that, if I reflect on my life, even before I decided not to go to the military service, I dropped out of high school at the age of 16. I left my parents' house pretty early. I always had a hard time like being in like structures that kind of like a 9 to 5 job was just not for me. I hardly ever was able to like make it in time to school, let alone to like be in an office. So that very short stint I had working in finance in New York right after Cornell just proved to me that I was not cut for it. One day I came with my Birkenstocks to the office, and my boss looked at me and she's like, you shouldn't be coming with your Birkenstocks to office. And I'm like, that's probably not the right place for me. And so I think that, the kind of flexibility that comes with creating your own work, as well as the creativity that is involved in like dreaming the future and then actually being able to create it in product, and then all the myriad of challenges that come with leading people and managing conflict, raising money, working on finance. Like, there is no better game than this. And you're also an operator, which means that you're building. I mean, this is just the most beautiful thing that one can do. And I really always felt that I am viewing this as a form of art, and creating companies. It's like a piece of art that you're like initially seeing it in your mind, in your vision, but then you're slowly kind of giving it body and shape and colors. And it's an ever evolving piece of art that is involving not just you, but many other people that you're bringing into the fold. And that's why people say it's very addictive. It is a very addictive type of a game. I was never addicted to video games, but I was definitely addicted to the startup game. I should say that.
It's funny that you would refer to it as art, so I have several friends who are Nigerian singers, like they're Afrobeats artists. We had one of them on our podcast, so called Rugers, like very famous. And I'd say like in terms of like how like their job as like a kind of like pop star is the most similar job I've come across to the job of a startup founder. Like
Wow. In
it
what
really
ways?
is like they have to be, on one hand, like they have to have like tremendous empathy with their customers, right? The listeners. They have to like know what they want and give it to them, which is what you do as a founder. There's like, they have to build this team and bring, their VCs to the, the labels along with them.
Mm-hmm.
And they and they need to like work hard and operationalize things. Like they have to go forward, stuff like that. It's this multifaceted thing. It's so interesting to think of building a startup as being something that's like you're an artist, like actually an artist. Because most people who go into startups, they're like big tech bureaucrats essentially. And like to me, that always felt it's like if you were happy working at Facebook as a vice president or whatever, like you just shouldn't be doing this. Like this is not. I mean, maybe you just hated being a vice president at Facebook, but if you were okay with being a vice president at Facebook, you're going to hate being a startup founder. And I think that is what most people experience. I don't know. I don't know if that resonates with you.
I I think that there are different types of people that go into becoming startup founders, and I definitely met a lot of creators like me. I think a lot of even founders that started as engineers. Oftentimes they have a similar profile because engineering is a very similar thing, or like writing code, I should say, to be more specific. Like you have this idea of a functionality or a machine that you're going to be creating, and then you're like putting it into code, and you have to perfect the code and debug it and write it again. I found a lot of creativity among uh, startup software developers that I worked with earlier in my career and throughout my career. And I think especially here in California, in the Bay Area, there's such a beautiful like intersection between the art world and the technology world. And it's very clearly felt in places like Burning Man, right, where these things come together. So I definitely think there is that group, and many of my friends here in the Bay Area when we were living here were part of, I would say, that profile. But I think that also when kind of the whole Silicon Valley scene became bigger and there's been a lot more money that comes here, then you start seeing other types of profiles coming into the profession, right? And maybe people that used to go to consulting before or go to investment banking, well, now they want to come to do a technology startup. And that's maybe when you start seeing a different type of profile going into the profession. Um, and I don't think it's bad, but maybe sometimes this type of people, they're better in a later stage startup, for example, not so much in an earlier stage startup.
What we want to talk about as a topic is, how do you, as a startup founder, maintain resilience when things go wrong, and specifically, how do you adjust your lifestyle? Like, what are the choices you need to make for that to be easy for you, essentially? And your company, Cheetah, I think around the time of COVID had some challenges, and maybe can you tell us a little bit about what happened there and how that impacted you personally?
Sure. So when COVID, happened, and when like the market shut down, which was in March 2020, just before then, Cheetah was just at its peak. It was, Cheetah is a tech-enabled food service distributor that is selling wholesale food and supplies to restaurants and wholesale food buyers who can order the supplies on our mobile application or web application and get them delivered next day. So we actually have warehouses with inventory. And at the time we were servicing thousands of restaurants across multiple markets in the US. We had our Bay Area market, we had our Texas market in Dallas, we had a market in LA, among others. And so we were literally just launched 3 very large distribution centers in these 3 markets. Each one of them had millions of dollars worth of inventory, more than 50% of which is perishable. We had hundreds of employees, and everything was going great. But then COVID happened, and when COVID happened and the market shut down, I mean, it hit restaurants. It was one of the sectors that was hit the hardest. And like overnight, their business went from 100% to, less than 20%. And if that's what happened to our customers, obviously that is going to happen to us. And so, I just can't describe like how really difficult it was, because we were at our maximum exposure in terms of cash out. and inventories that have to be like literally sold within days. And I think that at that point it kind of like hit me that I have to be like doing something very, very differently in order to survive and thrive through the storm. I kind of realized that this could be, I mean, intuitively, I realized this could be a massive growth opportunity for me if I knew how to handle it right. And so earlier I spoke with you about, viewing myself as an artist building these companies. But when COVID came, I realized I have to start viewing myself as an athlete that is, working to win a certain race that is happening like right now. And in that sense, like if you're an athlete and you're preparing for a race or you're preparing for a competition, you have to exercise extreme amount of discipline in how you are basically going to be eating and sleeping and exercising, so you can win that competition, you can win that race. And so I viewed this entire kind of time, this incredibly challenging, trying time, almost as a competition that I had to win. And I realized that like owning this discipline is going to be incredibly important. And so, yeah, I think that I already had a pretty good amount of routine in terms of like exercising or, meditating and other things like that. But there were many other things that I wasn't paying that much attention to. For example, I wasn't paying that much attention to sleep. I wasn't paying attention to like taking time off and spending it with my family, or, just letting my brain relax. I was like constantly working, constantly engaged. And I realized that in this moment in time, I have to build routines that are basically fulfilling me, because I won't be able to get fulfillment and recharging from the outside. I have to like build it into my day to day. I have to resource myself so I can resource others. Because at that time, Cheetah had hundreds of employees. And I needed to make sure that I can take care of them to the best of my abilities. And it was really one of the hardest things to do, is, having to like manage employees through so much crisis. We had to go through significant layoffs, as you can imagine, and doing that in a way that is just and right and graceful to the employees also require that type of resources. So yeah, I basically started developing a whole set of routines of self-discipline that seriously helped me to go through this. And later on, I kept like sticking to it, and it's shaped me in a very profound way.
I'm really curious to hear what those are specifically, but there's a kind of mindset or like way of thinking, which just sounds like you did, and I want to understand that a little bit more. So you had this challenge, and I think most people would say like, hey, here's a problem, and it's really bad that there's this problem, and this is like a setback. It sounds like your analysis of it was intuitively say, hey, here's this problem. This is an opportunity for me to grow as a person. And it's like this kind of like assumption that everything is great, and then kind of like seeking, validation in the fact-based world that everything is great. Like, is that so first, am I getting that right? Like, is that how you thought of it? And then second, is that kind of like how your mind normally works, or what's going on there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, again, like reflecting on it in hindsight, I do think that this is a very fundamental part of how I think about life, is that every setback is actually a great opportunity for growth. Not just to like go through it and like suffer through it and get to the other side, but actually use it as like an acceleration, as a trainer to step up your game. Because I mean, otherwise, like, what's what's the point? These crises, they're coming and they're going to be part of our lives, whether we want them or not. So we better try to like make them into something that helps us grow and helps us evolve. And in fact, when I reflect on, what I learned and how I had to like, work through the crisis of COVID together with my team, it really helped me to step up my game. I felt like I was going from one level to at least two levels up. And I hope that this experience is something that, and I believe it will be something I will carry with myself for the rest of my life, and certainly something that I've shared with other people, family, friends who have gone through crises of different types. It could be a health crisis of a very loved one, or a career change, or a breakup. And once you kind of tell yourself, this is actually my growth moment, it just like changes the whole way you're going to be experiencing this event or whatever is unfolding, and it's very empowering, actually.
And what's the meta, like, what is the kind of common, steps, right? Like, so like the way I understood what you're saying, and it might be wrong, is I'm pattern matching what I've seen other people, is like, the world is awesome. And then if something bad happens, you're like, well, it can't be bad because the world is not bad. And then it's like, well, actually, how is this awesome? Because it is awesome. And I just need to find the way in which it's awesome. Otherwise,
Yeah.
my entire perspective on the world is wrong. And I just have to find the way that's awesome. And then you discover it and you're like, oh, this is the jujitsu move to turn this seemingly bad thing into an accelerant. Right? So it's kind of like, assume the world's awesome, seek awesomeness, like refuse to see any non-awesomeness, and forces you to find these moves that are impossible to see otherwise. Like, is that your process, or is that not exactly right?
It's a very good question. I think that the process is accepting what comes for what it is, rather than looking for always things to be awesome. Just actually giving up that expectation that things will always be awesome, and not giving any sign to the events, just experiencing for what they are and what they can teach you. That's the move. That's the jiu-jitsu move. Because yes, I mean, if you think about it, like Cheetah was at its peak, it was doing amazing. We were on the top of the world, we were growing, we were doing nearly $150 million in annualized sales. I was managing the company I was dreaming of, and then all of a sudden the rug gets pulled under your feet, and I was thrown like years back into a crisis. And if I had interpreted it as like oh my God, like what happened, like why to us, and so on, I would lose every single bit of energy, of life energy I had in me to actually like deal with reality as it is being presented to me. So to go back to like what I said, it's just like not assigning a positive or a negative sign to anything, just like taking it for what it is and finding what you can do to keep growing up your game. Yeah, and these metaphors, they've actually been very helpful for me along my career. Earlier said the artist metaphor, the athlete metaphor, the game metaphor. When you're in a game and you're playing in a game, sometimes you're in like a shooter game and your character dies, and then you have to like start up again, and you have to like fight again, and you're getting like more and more tools. When you start thinking about yourself like you are actually in a game, then it just makes everything more interesting and more playful, even those very hard things that are there to kill you. And I think that kind of metaphor, that narrative, is something that just held me and just fortified me.
When you use a game metaphor, do you think of it as playing a game in first player mode or in third player mode? I don't know if that's kind of like clear to you, right? But if you play like an RPG game, you're either, you kind of like see the like just the eyes of the character in first player mode, or you can zoom out and you kind of see
It's
the whole
both.
thing.
It's both. Absolutely. It's both. You go in and out. You are first player mode because you are the actor, but essentially by seeing yourself in a game, it is a third player mode. Understanding actually that from the outside, you are a player in a game as well as everyone else is a third player mode. But then when you go in and you're actually acting in the moment, you're doing it in first player.
Right.
So you need to be able to move between them.
Yeah, super interesting. All right. Well, what are so you were faced by this challenge, and it sounds like you have a lot of advantages that a lot of others that others don't, and that's rooted in your life until then, right? Where you're like a very grounded person. You have this very like optimistic and positive, non-value assigning approach, and so you ran into this problem, and you
Yeah.
needed to transform yourself into, what the analogy uses an athlete. Like, what did that what did you need to change?
Sure. So I'll speak about the habits that I acquired from my own personal hygiene, so to say, and then I can also speak about the work I did with my team, because it is very important for me to stress that I would never have been able to do this without my team. It's never like only about yourself. Like how you carry yourself is super important, but like having a team that can do this with you is equally as important. So for me, it was about discipline in my routines. And I'm going to say things that I'm sure, you've heard many, many times, but, in that moment in time, it just became the focus of me that I'm not going to like change a iota from these routines because I needed them in order to be that athlete. And it was like my exercise routine, the food I put into my mouth, my sleep routine, and the activities that I did to replenish my energy that were not work related. So at that time, I was already exercising on a pretty regular basis. I was doing CrossFit once a week, and every now and then I would do yoga. But when COVID started, I actually went from once a week CrossFit to 4 times a week CrossFit. And I had an amazing trainer here in San Francisco, Lisa, and she was just incredible and super helpful through this. During that time, I also got one of my co-founders to get into CrossFit, and then a few others also joined. And so that became something that, was also incredibly supportive for other people except myself. And it was just like sacred. It's on the calendar. Every morning I start a day by going to this training. And I think it's very important that the training is a form of practice that increases your heart rate, such that you are able to like pull out of your loopiness of mind and just be within the moment. This was very important component of the CrossFit for me at the time. So 4 times a week CrossFit to start my day. I was doing it like either at 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning. And again, like never cancel that. Like that is sacred. The other thing that was very important was like my sleep schedule, and there's so much research today that shows like why sleep is important. But I have always been a person that just didn't sleep that much. I don't need that much sleep. Like naturally, I would sleep probably between 4 and 5 hours a night. And always work super late into the night. I would work like until 1, 2 a.m. But when this started, I realized I really needed my sleep. And so that was another thing that I was very focused on, like the minimum 7 hours a night of sleep. And then food, again, I was always eating very healthy, but I wasn't as strict with my food. And the trick that I found with the food, my diet, was to really remove any type of carb from my diet. I was already vegetarian, by the way. So I think also if you're a meat eater, it's very, very helpful to strongly think about reducing your meat consumption. But the carb is the key, because what happens when we consume carbs, we have these like sugar spikes and drops. And when you have the sugar spikes and drops, it basically consumes energy. And I needed all of my energy to be focused in the moment, in being able to maintain my mindset. And so, like, really removing all carbs from my diet, definitely no processed foods, no sweets during the week was critical to how I was able to handle my levels of energy. And then, over the weekend, I would give myself like a break and, have like a nice culinary experience. But again, it wasn't about like sitting in front of my TV and eating like junk food. It was like actually giving, respect to the food and going to like a beautiful restaurant and enjoying the food as like a form of entertainment, as something that replenished my energy, not just at the level of nutrition, but also at the level of impressions. So that was another component. Another component is vitamins and supplements, which I can speak a lot about. But there is one thing that I would love to share with you and with anyone who's listening to this podcast, is something I swear by, and it's how much vitamin C I take. I take a fairly large amount of vitamin C. I take 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C every day. And that's something I started doing already in 2014. And I swear by it because I haven't been sick since then with anything serious like a flu. I had COVID 3 times. I hardly felt it. Like, it is a huge booster to the immune system, and something that, again, I feel like really supported me through that. Just the fact that I didn't get sick, and it was COVID time. And it was after very, very long period of time when I got COVID, for the first time. It was like probably I think it was about 2 years after the pandemic outbroke when I got it for the first time. So yeah, just like 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C, 5,000 IUs of vitamin D every day are two habits that I've had before the pandemic, but really supported me during the pandemic. And then I said, after the kind of how you treat your body, which is like the exercise, the food, the sleep, and the supplements, there is like, what do you do to like replenish yourself mentally and emotionally? And that is also very important. I think that oftentimes during crisis, we kind of feel like we have to like get under, how do you call it, like under the plank, what you do in a military kind of sense, and you just like have to fight through it and brute force. You're not going to see your family, you're not going to like do anything fun because this is hard, and you just like have to go through it. And I think it's exactly the other way around. Like, this is like you have to play the long run view, like the marathon view, right? And in that sense, you have to like make sure that you're not running out of energy. So for me, it was the time with family that I had to like make sure I'm giving. And during the time when the pandemic hit, myself and my partner and our daughter, we lived in a big house in San Francisco with another family. And they have a son who's the same age of my daughter. I feel like he's like my stepson. And we all had our kids at home, and so we had to like take turns of like being with the kids. And maybe someone else would say, I'll just hire a babysitter. I don't have the time to be with my kid when my company is like falling apart. But I actually wanted to experiment with that time of like my shift was being with the kids, and seeing if it can actually help me to disconnect from the stress, the enormous stress I was in, and actually replenish myself. So I also want to say that time I had like 2 shifts every week of like 3-4 hours when I was with the kids. And in that time when I was with the kids, I basically was super strict about my phone usage. My phone was like somewhere else where I cannot touch it, and I was like fully intentional with the kids, just like in play mode. That was so incredibly helpful because you're like completely moving into a very different way of operating, and like using your head and using your heart and your emotions when you were playing with like 3-year-old kids. They were 3-year-old at the time. It was incredibly helpful for me, because like those 3 hours of like stepping out and like being in play mode just rejuvenated me and replenished me so much. And
So
the
there's
other
this.
activity that yeah, go ahead.
I was just going. There's this analogy that you'd used when we spoke earlier, It was, what you need to do, like there's too much for you to deal with. And the way to deal with the too much is not like, hey, I'm going to force myself to go to 120%. It's to kind of like increase the size of your receptacle, like how much you can take.
Yes. Yes.
It sounds like that's what you're describing here.
Yes, it's exactly right, Julian. It was exactly that point. It's about expanding my ability to hold by expanding my field, for the lack of better words. And yeah, some of it is in your body, but some of it is also in like allowing this other type of interactions to come into your day to day so that you can expand your field. And that was really the guiding principle, is expanding my ability to hold, expanding my field. So the time with the kids was incredibly important. And then I was about to say that the last thing that is very important for me to mention, connected to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, was the connection with nature. For me, nature is like one of the biggest therapists. I was just like going to nature, and just walking around the woods. The best thing for me about the pandemic was the fact that Muir Woods, which is like a world-class redwoods park in Mill Valley in the Bay Area, was closed to the public. Yet, uh, maybe I'm saying things I shouldn't be saying, but a few of us, including myself and my family and a bunch of locals, found our way into the park. And I was going there every weekend, and sometimes several times a weekend, like driving all the way from San Francisco into this like unbelievable park, and just like walking there almost by myself was one of the biggest blessings of the pandemic. And it didn't replace my usual therapist and coach, who was amazing, Yossi Amram. A small plug in and thank you to him. um it was a very important part of my routine, but like being able to go there and with my kid, it was just like amazing. And every weekend I make sure that there is at least one day I'm not working, and what I'm going to focus on is just that replenishing of my energy. So these are like the main highlights of the things that I did. The physical routine, or the physical discipline, the emotional discipline, and then like I would say more like the mind discipline that I acquired, and was just really enabled me to operate at a much higher level during the pandemic.
It's so interesting. So when I had a job, I mean, I'm unemployed now. When I had a job, I would work 6 days a week. So I take Saturday off. And now that I don't have a job, I work 7 days a week because I'm less stressed.
Yeah, it's
But yeah,
a
like I
different
think,
part of your flow.
yeah, it's like you just need like when there's a lot of chaos, the kind of constraining factor is your capacity to manage the chaos, and you need to kind of, as you say, proactively invest in your capacity to manage that chaos.
Yeah, you have to invest in it. And these habits replenish you. And then I would also say another important habit, which I forgot to mention, is meditation. And I'll explain why meditation is very important. I was exposed to meditation from a very, very young age, and practice it throughout my life with different levels of, consistency, I should say. I've never really been able to like build a fully consistent practice of meditation. But during the pandemic, I did make sure that I spend time on meditation at least once a day for at least 21 minutes, because meditation, what it does to you, it's not about relaxing. It's actually about being able to build a discipline of the mind, and seeing those like loopy thoughts or negative thoughts or destructive thoughts going in your head, and basically letting them move ahead. Like that practice of like changing, moving ahead. Anything that is not useful for you in the moment is this is an incredible tool to use. And then when you're like in the moment, you're like in the moment of the pandemic and things are falling apart and you're seeing all the money that you're losing and the people that you unfortunately have to say goodbye to, and those destructive thoughts are coming into your head, that discipline that you're developing with meditation is something you can practice in the moment, in the awaking state, in the interactive state, as a way to constantly focus your mind on what is actually useful and productive and efficient for you in that moment.
My friend Ben is really into meditation, and I've heard him use this phrase, I guess, it's just kind of like, or analogy. It's just like you have like negative thoughts or destructive thoughts that come knocking on your door, and you have to decide whether you're going to let them in or not. And like, does that kind of, that's what jumps in my mind when you said that thing that Ben had said.
Yeah, it's very much like that. The way I view it visually is almost like kind of like pages of news that are like passing in front of your head, and you just like have to like swipe them away if it's not like news that you actually want to be focusing on in the
Like
moment.
TikTok.
And they're like, yes, exactly. And it's not just like static news, it's very much alive videos that are like passing by, and you can get sucked into them, or you can just say, swipe, swipe. Oh, this is a good one. I'm going to go in. Or this one is not, swipe. And that's kind of like the visual that I was using quite a lot and continue to use to this day.
Interesting. Yeah. So, okay. Last question, because we're a little bit over and it's Sunday, and I know you're supposed to hang out with your friends. Okay. I've seen in the wild two kind of approaches, or two kind of achieving what you achieved, right? And I wonder if you fall into one of the two, or if you have a different approach. So one approach that I've seen works for people for adopting new habits is kind of like super OCD approach, right? It's kind of like the kind of like Apple Watch like step counter. So like like there are people who are very type A, and they really like controlling everything. They get a lot of validation from controlling everything, and they, by optimizing their lives, they, that's like that's why they do it. That's how it works for them. Just like this, very, it's kind of like optimizing your life sort of mindset. The other approach, I like to think of it as like, it's not hard for Brad Pitt to stay in shape because he takes it really, really seriously that he has to look good, right? It's just kind of like,
Yes.
if you take yourself seriously, it then becomes much easier, right? So say like, hey, look, if I put on 10 pounds, I lose 10 pounds, who's going to notice? I mean, that's the case for me. Like, legitimately, I wake up at 4 p.m. now, and like, I never see anybody. I never talk to anybody. So like, if I put on weight, like, no one's going to notice. If I lose weight, no one's going to notice. And that's like very different from Brad Pitt, where if he puts on a couple of pounds, I mean, that's his entire job. This is livelihood. And there's this like sense of like, hey, this thing about me really matters. I really matter. And it's important that I be excellent. And that's a kind
Yes.
of like mindset that, seems to work for some people. I don't know if you feel you fall into one of those buckets or neither.
No, I think it's a very, very beautiful way of describing it. I think the first one that you're describing is, you know, is not always the best way to go, because you need to remember that in order to develop long-term habits, you need to enjoy them. They need to make you feel good about yourself. And if you're doing it with this like mindset of stress, I have to do it, and like I have to count my steps, and I don't know, maybe for some people it works, but it sounds like it's coming more from like self punishment place rather than like, let's actually do something, as you said in the other one, like, let's do something that is good for us because this is who we are as professionals. So that's what I mentioned earlier when I started thinking of myself as an athlete, that I am a startup CEO and a leader going through a major crisis, and I have to like carry myself as a professional. That's when I started taking care of myself in a very serious way, but it was intentional. It was with that intentionality that this is, yeah, this is part of what I need to do as a professional to earn my salary and earn my equity, earn my respect, you know. So I think it's more along the lines of the second case that you described.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. I'm actually gonna share this episode with my wife. I don't think she watches any of her content, but I'll force her to watch this one because we were discussing similar things recently, and you're just so much more insightful than me, at least, on this. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
And for everyone listening, thank you for putting in the hour with us. Naama, where can people find you? I think you have on LinkedIn. What's
Yes.
the best way for people to get more Naama Moran in their life if they're looking for that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the best place to find me is on LinkedIn, as well as on my email. It's naama.moran@gmail.com.
Very generous of you. Give out your email. Mine is actually the same, Julian.Newman, but so I guess neither are very at Gmail. So neither are very difficult to guess, but
Exactly. We were one of the
but
first people to join Gmail if we have those emails, right?
exactly. It just says that you're old, or I'm old. Like I have all I have like Julian Newman Twitter, Julian Newman everything.
Yeah, same.
Even well, I guess your name is kind of unusual as well, which mine is too, because it's written like Julien, like French Newman, so not
Uh-huh.
many people have it. That's probably
Yeah,
also part.
understood.
It's not just that we're old; it's also we're unusual.
Or early technology adopters. Why don't you think about it this way?
Well, it was really great seeing you, and thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Julian. It was such a pleasure.